Inside the Kremlin Palace in August 1570, a Russian nobleman knelt before Ivan the Terrible in absolute silence. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of a man whose voice had shattered. His body remained intact enough to kneel, but nothing else remained whole. Ivan sat elevated on his throne, methodically eating grapes while watching the wreckage below him. The prince had been stripped of everything, his dignity, his status, his humanity, all torn away in front of the entire court. Wives of other nobles stood frozen, forced to witness what happened to those who displeased the Tsar. Executioners worked with terrible precision while Ivan provided commentary. Not in anger, in the tone someone uses discussing the weather. Still breathing. Good, let's continue, Ivan said, his voice casual, almost bored. The instruments descended again. This wasn't punishment, it was pedagogy, a lesson delivered through flesh and blood to everyone watching. The message was surgical in its clarity. Challenge the Tsar and your body becomes a public demonstration. Your death won't be quick, your shame won't be private. Every person you ever loved will see what remains of you. When the prince finally collapsed, Ivan had him dragged through Moscow's streets so the entire city could witness what rebellion produces. Children watched from doorways. Merchants stopped their work to stare. Some wives turned away. Others watched between their fingers, unable to look yet unable to turn completely from the spectacle. The prince died that evening, but his family carried the memory for generations. His sister would wake from nightmares decades later. His widow would never marry, her sense of dignity too shattered to imagine another man's touch. Ivan had discovered something more powerful than execution. He discovered that destroying a person's dignity before their body died created a terror that couldn't be forgotten, couldn't be rationalized, couldn't be escaped. It spread through bloodlines like plague, infecting not just the executed, but everyone connected to them. Their children, their siblings, their entire lineage marked forever by what they had witnessed. This wasn't unique to Ivan. Across centuries and continents, rulers independently discovered the same weapon. Turn the human body into a tool of political terror. Combine physical violation with intimate humiliation, and you create something that transcends simple death. You create something that destroys the victim, their family, and anyone who might consider defying you. For thousands of years, kings and emperors obsessed over the same dark question. How do you make people obey? Not through law or reason, but through absolute fear. How do you demonstrate that you possess not just power over death, but power over dignity itself? The answer they found was more horrifying than any battlefield carnage, more effective than any army. They discovered that the human capacity for shame could be weaponized more effectively than any sword. Ivan didn't invent cruelty, but he perfected its application in ways that would influence rulers across centuries. He began his reign in 1547 as a capable, even enlightened administrator who consolidated power and reformed legal systems. Then his first wife, Anastasia, died in 1560. That death broke something fundamental in him. Following the funeral, Ivan vanished from Moscow for months, retreating to his religious holdings. When he returned, he was fundamentally different. He had become paranoid, convinced that the entire aristocracy was conspiring against him. He created the Opeknina, a state within a state governed by his personal guard, men dressed in black who answered only to him. These weren't soldiers bound by military discipline. They were Ivan's personal instruments of terror, and they operated under a philosophy that fear was the only language that mattered. A German mercenary named Heinrich von Staden served in Ivan's guard and recorded the Tsar's practices in meticulous detail that haunts historians even today. He documented that Ivan didn't merely order tortures from a distance. He attended them personally. He watched, he spoke to victims, he mocked them, he sometimes sat and ate while watching people die, demonstrating through his casual consumption that their suffering was beneath his notice, that their agony wasn't even significant enough to distract him from his meal. One of his preferred punishments for nobles suspected of disloyalty was public mutilation conducted in town squares or sometimes in the Kremlin itself, with the entire court watching. Ivan would allegedly ask victims mid-procedure if they felt more loyal now, or make obscene commentary about what was happening to their bodies. The procedure wasn't quick, it was deliberately prolonged, allowing victims to experience maximum suffering while maximum witnesses observed. But that was just one layer of Ivan's punishment architecture. He understood that attacking an individual wasn't enough. He needed to attack entire families to spread terror effectively. Russian chroniclers recorded that he forced the wives of executed nobles to appear at court, where they were publicly stripped of their status and dignity. Some were sent to convents, locked away from society for the rest of their lives, their bodies confined as punishment for their husbands' alleged crimes. Others were distributed among Ivan's personal guard, forced marriages that ensured these women lived their remaining years as property, never free from the reminder of their family's destroyed status. If you're finding these dark chapters of history as haunting as I am, please consider subscribing. These aren't easy stories to tell or to hear, but they're important ones. They reveal truths about power and human nature that we can't afford to forget. Your subscription helps ensure these voices from history, these warnings from the past, continue to be heard. Click that button below, because what comes next in our story will challenge everything you thought you knew about cruelty and control. In January 1570, during the sacking of Novgorod, chroniclers reported that Ivan ordered the city's women to be systematically violated as collective punishment for Novgorod's alleged support of his enemies. The violence wasn't spontaneous mob action. It was organized, systematic, coordinated by Ivan's officials. Ivan watched from an elevated platform, not as an observer, but as a conductor, orchestrating the destruction. The purpose was explicitly pedagogical. The population needed to see that challenging the Tsar didn't just result in execution. It resulted in the complete annihilation of everything you valued, everyone you loved, your family's honor, your daughter's dignity, your wife's safety. His logic was chilling and calculated. Humiliation of an intimate nature was more effective than death for terrorizing populations. Death was final. It ended suffering. Execution happened once. But violation combined with public shame created something that never ended. Victims lived with the memory every waking moment. Families lived with destroyed honor that cascaded through generations. The population lived knowing that disloyalty didn't just bring execution. It brought systematic annihilation of everything that made you human. A nobleman's wife would never walk through Moscow without people knowing what had happened to her husband. A merchant's daughter would never marry without her suitor knowing her father had been broken in the square. The terror infected the entire city, spreading like poison through social networks, ensuring that everyone understood the cost of resistance. But what happened next will shock even those familiar with history's darkest corners, because Ivan's methods weren't isolated incidents in one cruel reign. They were part of a pattern that stretched across continents and centuries, repeated independently by rulers who discovered the same terrible truth about human psychology. Nearly 600 years before Ivan carved his path through Russian nobility, another ruler on the opposite side of the world was discovering similar patterns of intimate punishment. In Cairo, Caliph al-Hakim Bayam ruled Egypt from 996 until 1021 AD with a mindset that seemed fundamentally divorced from normal human restraint. He wasn't remembered as a successful military conqueror or effective administrator. He was remembered primarily for issuing bizarre, intricate decrees that seemed designed to control every aspect of his subjects' private existence, to regulate not just their actions, but their thoughts, their desires, their most intimate impulses. He banned women from leaving their homes entirely. This wasn't a punishment for specific crimes. This was an absolute prohibition embedded in law, a belief that women's presence in public space itself constituted transgression. To enforce this decree, he ordered cobblers to stop manufacturing women's shoes. The reasoning was coldly logical. If women had no shoes, they couldn't walk. If they couldn't walk, they couldn't leave their homes. Any woman caught outside her home despite the decree faced public humiliation in Cairo's streets, not as singular punishment, but as repeated public spectacle. These weren't quiet sentences carried out in darkness. They were performances designed to broadcast the consequences of disobedience to anyone watching. Contemporary Arab chroniclers documented that al-Hakim possessed an almost obsessive fixation on controlling his subjects' intimate behavior. He believed society possessed moral contaminants that required purification, that desire itself was a disease requiring treatment, and that he alone possessed the philosophical authority to determine what thoughts and feelings his subjects were permitted to experience. He banned the manufacture and sale of foods he considered stimulants, items he believed aroused desire or generated energy of an inappropriate nature. The categories were absurdly broad, encompassing fish from certain waters, vegetables grown in specific regions, any food that contemporary medical theory associated with generating heat in the body. Merchants caught selling these prohibited items were quietly arrested or fined. They were publicly mutilated in the marketplace in ways that attacked their most intimate identity. In al-Hakim's philosophy, by removing a man's capacity for certain functions, he was essentially removing the source of transgression from society itself. The removal became philosophical theater. Eliminate the instrument and you eliminate the sign. The mutilated merchant would remain in Cairo, alive but marked, a permanent testament to the cost of violating al-Hakim's moral vision. Other merchants would see him in the marketplace and understand without words what happened to those who sold forbidden goods. One documented case described a man accused of looking at a woman with inappropriate intention. The charge wasn't that he'd touched her or spoken to her, he'd simply looked with desire. For this glance, this momentary lapse of visual propriety that likely nobody else even noticed, al-Hakim ordered mutilation, followed by forced gender humiliation. The man was compelled to wear women-esque clothing and work in the marketplace as the woman for the remainder of his life. He wasn't isolated or hidden away. He was forced into public spaces, forced to work, forced to participate in society while marked forever by his punishment. Every day became a living sentence. Every transaction became testimony to his transgression. His family would encounter him occasionally and be forced to acknowledge what he'd become. He was transformed into a walking warning against desire itself, a physical embodiment of al-Hakim's philosophy that certain impulses were something to be violently eradicated from society. Political enemies received different treatment, but equally elaborate and equally psychological. When al-Hakim discovered conspiracy among his viziers, his trusted advisors, he didn't arrest them quietly or execute them in private. First came the parade. The viziers were forced through Cairo's streets mounted backward on donkeys, a position of absolute humiliation. Riding backward meant they couldn't maintain dignity or balance. It was physically uncomfortable and visually ridiculous. The entire city watched as al-Hakim's own close advisors were paraded like animals, exposed to mockery and contempt. Citizens were encouraged to throw things, to spit, to verbally abuse these formerly powerful men. Then came mutilation. Only after the viziers had endured the parade, experienced their status, destroyed publicly, suffered the physical violation, came execution. Al-Hakim's philosophy seemed to be that death was too quick, that physical pain was insufficient, that true punishment required destroying a person's place in society first, then destroying their body, then finally ending their life. Al-Hakim disappeared mysteriously in 1021 during one of his nocturnal walks through Cairo, probably assassinated, possibly by his own sister who'd grown weary of his tyranny and the suffering it produced. But his methods had already been documented by historians and would be replicated by other rulers who understood their psychological efficiency. The pattern worked. People feared him not because they might die, but because they knew that if they displeased him, they would be destroyed in ways far worse than death. They would be humiliated, mutilated, turned into living examples of what rebellion produced. But perhaps the most sophisticated application of these principles came from an unexpected source. France in the 15th century, under Louis XI, known as the universal spider for his web of political intrigues and his ability to manipulate power through calculated cruelty, demonstrated that intimate punishment wasn't limited to distant caliphates or Russian despots. Louis consolidated royal power not through military prowess or administrative innovation, but through creating an atmosphere of such pervasive fear that nobody dared move against him. Philippe de Commines, a chronicler who served Louis closely, documented several inventive punishments that revealed Louis's sophisticated understanding of psychological devastation and how to weaponize the human body as a tool of political control. Louis had iron cages constructed with deliberate precision, so small that prisoners could neither stand upright nor lie down completely. The dimensions were calculated to create maximum physical discomfort. A man trapped in one of these cages had to crouch perpetually, his knees bent against the sides, his spine curved in positions that produced constant pain. Nobles who betrayed Louis occupied these cages for months or years, their bodies slowly deteriorating from the inability to straighten, their minds breaking from the perpetual physical torment combined with complete isolation. But Louis added a crucial refinement that elevated this punishment beyond simple physical torture. The cages were displayed in public squares where the population could see them, could watch the prisoners suffering, could observe what happened to those who defied the king. Some prisoners were forced to wear only undergarments during their confinement. Others were kept completely exposed, their bodies on constant public view. The prisoners couldn't escape their humiliation. Commines documented that crowds would gather to look at caged nobles, to watch them waste away, to see powerful men reduced to animals confined in small spaces. Merchants in the square began their days seeing these cages. Children grew up viewing them as normal fixtures of their city. The psychological impact extended far beyond the prisoners themselves. Everyone understood without explicit instruction what happened to those who questioned royal authority. Cardinal Jean Ballieu conspired against Louis and received 11 years in an iron cage from 1469 to 1480. According to Commines, Ballieu was periodically stripped and exhibited as part of his punishment regimen, meaning his ordeal wasn't static or unchanging. It was perpetually renewed and reactivated. Guards would remove him from his cage at irregular intervals, force him into public view, then parade him before returning him to confinement. Ballieu never knew when the next exhibition would occur. He could spend weeks in darkness and isolation, then suddenly be dragged out and exposed to public mockery. The unpredictability was part of the torture. It prevented him from ever adjusting to his circumstances, from finding any mental stability or coping mechanism. His torture was engineered to be eternally fresh, eternally devastating. These weren't isolated incidents of royal cruelty. They were systematic applications of psychological warfare that rulers across centuries discovered independently. From Ivan's Moscow to al-Hakim's Cairo to Louis's Paris, the pattern remained consistent. Attack not just the body, but dignity. Destroy not just the individual, but their family. Create not just pain, but shame that never ends. Make the punishment so intimate, so humiliating, so utterly devastating that the memory of it spreads through society like a virus, infecting everyone who witnesses it, everyone who hears about it, everyone who might ever consider resistance. The question that haunts us across centuries is simple yet profound. What does it say about power that so many rulers, separated by time and geography and culture, independently arrived at the same conclusion, that the most effective way to control people wasn't through laws or armies, but through attacking their most fundamental sense of human dignity? That the body could be transformed from a vessel of life into a tool of political terror? Leave a comment below and tell me, do you think these methods of punishment reveal something fundamental about human nature and power? Or were they aberrations, the work of uniquely cruel individuals? I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts on this dark chapter of history. And remember, by understanding the depths to which power can fall, we arm ourselves against ever letting it fall that far again.